Thank you. It's my pleasure today to be able to introduce these speakers, starting with Keith Allred. Keith is the founder of Common Sense American, a national, nonpartisan organization that brings Republicans, Democrats, and independents together to find practical bipartisan solutions. His work has helped Congress pass landmark legislation on issues like surprise medical billing, infrastructure, and the Electoral Count Act. Keith was the first professor of conflict resolution at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Keith has also had senior roles in business, including as a partner at the Cicero Group and a board member of Perpetual Resources. A fifth-generation Idahoan who grew up working summers on the family cattle ranch, Keith finished 8th in the world standings at the National Cutting Horse Association after competing in the World Finals in Fort Worth. He and Christine are the proud parents of Anna, Dan, and Kate. I've appreciated knowing Keith. Keith, in my estimation, is the leading individual in fostering bipartisan relationships and solutions on Capitol Hill today. I like to describe Keith as a founder, a recovering academic, and an Idaho cowboy. Please help me welcome Keith.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Mary. Thanks for that warm introduction, and just delighted to be here with you today and share the program with my good friend Maury Giles and our dear, close working relationship with his organization, Braver Angels. We really like what the Carter School does, what this conference does, what the Pizza and Perspectives series does. We are a big believer at the National Institute for Civil Discourse on how productive it is to take a deep look at research with a really practical eye towards what insights does it give us into how we could make the world a better place, and particularly how we could get to a better place in our bitter politics today. So this just feels like a fantastic place to have this kind of conversation. So I'm going to start by, our session together, Maury and I, is just going to kind of show that blend. As Mary said, I'm a recovering academic, but I sometimes relapse. And so I'm going to start a little bit on the academic side and share with you some of how we would describe the research on polarization. We've got leading experts who are not recovering academics, but real academics doing that work in the room here. But I'm going to give you kind of a high-level summary of how we would look at the contours of polarization today, and then the insights that we've drawn from that to actually make a big splash in Congress, and as Mary said, rack up a 4-for-4 track record of passing legislation in Congress by demonstrating where everyday Americans actually agree on the issues and then engage in Congress with those results. So let me ask this. Let me start this way. Everybody in this room has been thinking about polarization some, and you've certainly been thinking about it today at this conference. But I want to, by show of hands, get a sense of how many of you would say that this would be a fair description of your view of American politics today, that you have a sense that politics have always had a partisan nature to it, and there's always been a little bit of bitterness and rough and tumble to it, but that you have a kind of sinking feeling that there's something a little different today, that it feels more fundamentally worse, that things are really kind of going off the rails and you're really worried about the future there. How many would that? Yeah. Right, that really describes all of us. We saw some of the data in the previous presentation there. It is sobering what is going on in American politics today. Now, often when we have a sense that things are worse now, things were a little better in the good old days, when you look at the data actually says, well, yeah, not so much. They were problematic back then in that golden age also. I'd suggest, like I think many people in this room, that the data actually suggests, in most respects, it's at least as bad as you kind of feel like it is, and it might be, in many respects, actually a little worse than you recognize it is. So I want to just kind of telegraph the arc of my remarks is, if you're a little depressed about American politics, which it's clear that you are from our little straw poll here, I'm going to maybe make you a little more depressed first. Sorry about that. You're probably not needing that. But then I am going to pick out a few points of hope in the data, and not just as a kind of theoretic points of hope, but then tell you about how we have leveraged those for actual concrete success in arguably the hardest place to do it, and that right now, and that's the U.S. Congress. Starting off with the more sober parts, all right? Everybody ready for that? So I think one of the most compelling pieces of research showing just how serious it is the work by Poole and Rosenthal using what's called nominate scores to characterize our polarization today. And they set out to analyze the more than 14 million roll call votes that have been cast since 1789. And they look, for example, on a given roll call vote, how did Elizabeth Warren vote, and who voted with her, and who voted on the other side of her. And they calculated mathematically the dimension that best accounted for that pattern of voting across all 14 million roll call votes. And what they derived from that was these nominate scores, which go from a -1 to a +1. And you can score every senator and every representative on that dimension going all the way back to 1789. And for the last full Congress, concluded just a little under a year ago, here's what it looked like on that dimension. And you can see Elizabeth Warren, the furthest to the left in the Senate, Bernie Sanders, fourth furthest to the left, furthest to the right, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, and Tommy Tuberville, and closest to the center for the Democrats was Joe Manchin, closest to the center for Republicans, Senator Susan Collins. And so we would all look at that and say, oh, that's clearly measuring ideology. That's measuring conservative to liberal. Now, they didn't set out to measure ideology. This is just the dimension that emerges mathematically when you try to explain the pattern of voting across our 230 years plus under the Constitution. So it is the dimension that best explains the pattern of voting. Now, another useful aspect of these nominate scores, then, is that we can calculate the average nominate score for each party and then look at the distance between those two averages to calculate what they call the polarization index. You can see at the conclusion of the last full Congress, it was at 0.884, and you have this kind of gap in between the Republican and Democratic conference in the Senate. Now, here's what it looked like 1977 to 1978. You can see the polarization index was quite a bit less at 0.589, and there's not a gap, but an overlap between the two parties. In fact, 18 senators were in the overlap. Nearly 1/5 of the Senate was in the overlap, whereas today we have that big gap and overall a much bigger polarization index. Now you can actually graph that polarization index then going all the way back to 1789, and here's what that looks like. So we have quantifiably set the record for the most deeply divided along partisan lines that Congress has ever been in our history. But that's not even the most depressing part. The most depressing part is we have never before had a more than 40-year trend line of rising polarization. We've had spikes in polarization before. I'm going to put a few more landmarks on there so you can see it a little more clearly. But we've had spikes in polarization before, but they've tended to come down about as rapidly as they went up. We have never had anything like this in American history before of more than 40 years of not only increasing but somewhat accelerating polarization. So it suggests something deeper and more systemic is going on, a change, just a pendulum swing. And there's a lot that goes into that. That gets a little complicated, but I think the fair consensus that the first order effect that explains that is the ideological sorting of the parties for the first time in American history. For a set of odd historical reasons, throughout American history, we've tended to have ideologically mixed parties, conservatives, moderates, and liberals in both parties. And that started to change for the first time in earnest in a long-term way in the late 1970s. So I would argue that that is the match that lit the polarization fire that is threatening to burn down American democracy. And then we have added all kinds of accelerants onto that fire since then. And so there's a little bit of that evidence that it's not just that sinking feeling you have in your gut, but that something is really different, that we're in new and treacherous political waters that we have not navigated before in our country. Okay, polarization today is sufficiently unique that political scientists have had to draw new distinctions to adequately describe it. And one of the important distinctions is to distinguish between two different kinds of polarization. One is issues polarization. That's what we probably often think about, is how far apart are everyday Republicans and Democrats on the issues of the day. But it turns out to also be important to think about polarization as social polarization, sometimes called affective polarization. So this is how much anger and animosity do we feel across the partisan divide. Political scientists have also found it important to distinguish between who are we talking about who is polarized. And it turns out to be important to distinguish between political leaders and citizens on the one hand, and then within citizens to distinguish between the really politically active, different scholars define that differently, but between the kind of 5 and of the citizens that are most politically active, and then everybody else, everyday Americans, we'll call them. And so if you kind of survey dozens of studies on polarization done over the last 20 or 30 years and try to characterize these dimensions of polarization, here's what you find. Highest levels of polarization ever recorded and rising rapidly in every single combination, with one important exception, and that is everyday citizens on issues. So elected leaders, issues polarization, highest ever recorded and rising rapidly. That's primarily the nominate scores, but lots of other evidence on that I showed you already. High social polarization. Certainly among the politically active, they are high in polarization on both, and on issues polarization. The folks who are more true believers, conservatives or liberals, tend to have kind of more genuinely extreme views on the issues. But the really interesting column is the everyday Americans. Here, the social polarization is the highest ever recorded and rising rapidly, yet issues polarization remains quite low. Now that's a curious finding. That's a curious combination. One way Liliana Mason at Johns Hopkins has described this is to say, we're a nation that's really mad at each other, even though we agree on a lot. Now, of course, the problem is, and I think Maury's going to talk about this a little bit more, the problem is we don't actually know that we agree on so much. There's something called the perception gap, where we think that we are far more divided than we really are. Part of it is that we're taking the politically active as representative of the full group. So we see the most extreme members of the other group who, because they're extreme, talk louder and longer than the rest of us and create an outsized impression. And we think they are far more representative of everybody on that side than they really are. And both sides are doing that to each other. And that's a social psychological phenomenon. You find that between groups that have tensions between them, every kind of group known to humankind. But it is also well documented with respect to the two parties in the United States today. So, but I want to keep an eye on that low and slowly rising issues polarization, because there's one of the points of light that said to us, hey, there's a place where you can intervene and maybe make a bigger difference than you might think. Okay. Another unique aspect of politics today is that while they are the most deeply divided in American history, they're also the most evenly divided in American history. And that trend line started almost as soon as the polarization increase started. Starting around 1980, we ushered in the period of the greatest parity between the two parties in Congress and in the presidential elections that we've ever seen in American history. Now, this plays out differently in the individual states, as we've had geographic sorting along party lines. You know, red states are becoming redder and blue states are becoming bluer, so there's not parity within state legislatures often, for example. But within the American Congress, striking levels of this. So, you know, you have to check on the given day in the House of Representatives whether Republicans right now have a 3 or a 4 vote advantage, and which special election has been held and who's been sworn in and who's just announced their retirement. And so it is, out of 435 members of the House, it's 3 or 4. It's 1%. Today in the Senate, it's a 3-vote majority. Last Congress, it was a 1-vote majority for the Democrats. And so this is not typical in American politics. This is unusual. And some of the best work done on this documents the many ways in which the narrowness or the evenness of the divide has made it even a deeper, more bitter divide. It sure cranks up the stakes, right? When you're just barely hanging on to the majority or you're just barely out of the majority. And so there's lots of evidence about how it makes it more bitter. But I'm going to make a little bit of a counterintuitive point now. You could start to feel like bipartisanship was kind of a naive notion today. I'm going to argue the opposite, that the truly naive notion is that you can do very much in a significant way on a partisan basis. Now, that's always been true in American politics by design of the founders. Founders took separation of powers further than anybody else had ever taken it, with the explicit purpose of making it very hard to do anything on a partisan basis. That was explicitly what they were trying to do. But to that, we've now added these very narrow partisan majorities. That is another factor that makes it very, very hard to do things on a purely partisan basis. And so that has this, I think, somewhat counterintuitive effect that those few remaining senators that are not in the overlap anymore, but closest to the center, have huge outsized power. Because you're going to have to get some bipartisan consensus for most legislation to pass. And so they end up having disproportionate power if you're going to make that happen. So there's a few more details that I might get into if we want to talk about this, and that I can give you kind of the details of the legislation passed. But it remains true, the pattern of 230 years under the Constitution, that major legislation far more typically passes on a bipartisan basis than a partisan basis. And that, if anything, has become truer over the last 10 years. So we took this combination of things, the low and slowly rising issues polarization among everyday citizens, and we said, hey, there might be a way then of mobilizing everyday citizens specifically around issues that could get you further than you think, that there's a more natural, ready consensus among everyday citizens, that you could find agreement more easily than you thought, and then engage Congress with those results, and engage Congress generally, but with particular focus on those members of Congress in the center who have outsized influence. Now, that is what led me to found Common Sense American, and I'll just say, if you ever have an idea where the primary metric of success is literally passing an act of Congress, get a different idea. That's just crazy to do that. But I'm delighted to report that we now have 85,000 members, balanced left, right, and center, in every state in the country. And we have a 4-for-4 track record in Congress, as Mary was indicating. I piloted 5 years in my home state of Idaho, and we had really impressive record there too. We passed a legislation right out of the gate. And when I showed up here in DC 7 years ago, and I said, hey, we've had this thing we did in the Idaho legislature, and we're going to do this now in the United States Congress, and you can just imagine the kind of reception that people, it's like, oh, that's really nice that you could do that in the Idaho legislature. This is the United States Congress. Things are a little different here. And I like to say, yeah, it's been a little easier in the Congress than it was in the Idaho legislature. We were not 4-for-4. We batted about 500 in the Idaho legislature. It is truly shocking to me that we've been able to pull that off at that level. But it does turn out that if we pay attention to the research and look for not just how dark a picture it paints, but we look for those points of light, and then think practically and strategically about how to mobilize those assets to fight this wildfire of American polarization threatening to burn down American democracy, we can get a lot further than we think. The other way to put this is, this system works really well in the way it's designed to if we try to engage it in a purely partisan way, which is it is designed to create frustration for all is really good at doing that if we engage it in a partisan way. And if we engage it in a bipartisan way, where we are looking to find those solutions wise enough to attract support across our partisan divide, it still works remarkably well. We just aren't engaging it enough there in that way. But when you do it, it's shockingly effective. A brand new group over 7 years can rack up a 4-for-4 track record. So I'm going to introduce Maury here in a second and have good conversations about this and how we do. I'm going to say just a bit more about how we do this. But I want to just throw in there, if you would like to do something more than wring your hands and worry about the future, if you'd like to be part of the solution, please join commonsenseamerican.org and become one of our members. It is a crazy influential way to help things be a little more sane in the American Congress. Let me just say a bit about the details of how it works. So we work with these 85,000 members by going through a series of 4 steps. First, we pick 2 issues per Congress to work on. We have a whole process for doing that. Second, we develop a thorough policy brief on that question. And these are policy briefs, not position papers. We're not trying to tell the American people what the right answer is. And in fact, the core part of the brief is we make the strongest case for and against each proposal in the brief. Third, our members commit an hour per year to reviewing the brief and weighing in. So they indicate whether they support or oppose each of the measures. And then fourth, we engage Congress with the results. And we have a very robust congressional engagement process. We have several Common Sense American state ambassadors in the room. You guys want to raise your hands? I can see 2 at least. So they help lead that effort at scheduling and then conducting those briefings. And on our last victory, which was just a couple of months ago, getting Congress to pass Workforce Pell, extending Pell Grants to shorter workforce programs, we conducted briefings with 320 offices. So when we say we engage, we really engage Congress and we engage broadly, but we have worked especially closely with the Senate's Common Sense Coalition, which is the group up until last Congress was led by Senators Manchin and Collins, and that is now being led by Senators Murkowski and Bennett. And in 3 of our 4 victories, it has been in partnership with them. And I'll just mention that over the last 10 years, there have been 9 major pieces of legislation passed, 3 on a partisan basis, the first Trump tax cut and the most recent Big Beautiful Bill, and 1 on a Democratic partisan basis. That was the Biden Inflation Reduction Act. But in that same period, there have been 6 other major pieces of legislation passed. So that has been the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Act, the Safer Communities Act, the Respect for Marriage Act, the Electoral Count Reform Act, and the No Surprises Act. All 6, every single one of those, was led by the Senate's Common Sense Coalition. So the center, you would never get this. This is the most fundamental feature of American politics that is missed today. If you're just watching the news, you would never get that the center of American policymaking over the last 10 years has not been the White House, has not been the Speaker's office, has not been the Senate Majority Leader's office. It has been the Senate's Common Sense Coalition. When we pass major bipartisan legislation, which we actually still pass at about historic levels of frequency, it is led by that group. That's where the action is. Now, the media is not you're never going to get that from your cable news, right? But that is where the action is. And so there's the point of hope that as sobering as our politics are today, there is a place for everyday citizens that is remarkably powerful, and that we still have allies in the Congress who, because of the narrow partisan majorities, can have outsized influence, and we can still actually pass significant legislation on a bipartisan basis if we do our part. One way I describe that is, if we're going to get to a better place, then the American people will have to be our saving grace because we are less polarized than the rest. So we're going to have to step up and do our part, and Common Sense American is a way for them to do that. Good, so I'm going to pause here. I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Maury, and then he's going to present a little bit, and then we'll sit down and have a little bit of a panel discussion. So I've already told you Maury's most important distinguishing characteristic, and that is that he's Utah's state ambassador for Common Sense American. He has done some other things in his life besides that of some consequence, though. For 5 years, in the early part of his career, he was a journalist and worked on political campaigns. And for the last 30 years, he has worked on brand and business strategy in American industry. But in that time, I mean, I've known Maury a while, and I've never known him to let any grass grow under his feet, and he's always been very busy. But somehow he's managed over the last 5 or 6 years to be really deeply engaged in the bridging movement. And, you know, there are a lot of people engaged in it, but Maury just had this ability, like everywhere I showed up, there was Maury and playing some kind of important roles. I'm like, how are you doing this? Because I know you're pretty busy. But worked with Braver Angels over that period, and also worked with us for Common Sense American in these volunteer roles, like being state ambassador in Utah for us. Delightfully, Braver Angels made the wise decision a couple of months ago to make him the new CEO and president of Braver Angels. He is a spectacular leader who is as passionate as anybody I know in this field. There's one other distinguishing characteristic that you ought to know about Maury before we bring him up to the podium, and that he has no less than 10 kids. So you should ask him about that story sometime. Maury?
It's always fun and a little risky to have Keith introduce me. Since I am going to talk a little bit about stereotypes, I'll just deal with that one right out of the gate. He says Utah, I say 10 kids, and he goes, oh, of course he has 10 kids. He lives in Utah. Two things about that you should know. I moved to Utah 5 years ago, even though I was born there. My parents were going to school at BYU. But I have 10 kids in a blended family, and the story that I can tell you about that at some point, if you'd like to know, is I'm married to my best friend's widow. A story that I think of Jody as my miracle, and the one thing that's the hardest about this new job with the amount of energy of traveling all over the place, even more than I did in my corporate career, is I got to hurry and get back to her because she is my miracle. But we've got kids from the age of 31 to 17, and what's interesting about that for our family is they actually represent the country quite well in terms of 5 of them are pretty supportive of Trump, and 5 of them could not stand anything related to Trump. And it's led to some interesting moments. In fact, we just had we've been married 9 years, and we tried to start getting a new tradition going in our, we're trying to make up for lost time, right, with our blended family. So we have a Halloween party we do every year. It's a lot of fun. Everybody comes. But on a very personal note, we ended up this year, was the first time since we moved to Utah, that one of our sons and his wife did not come because he and his sister, on the day of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which 4 of our kids went to school there, well, 3 of our kids, we have 5 of our kids, 5 of our kids are still in school, but none there right now, and my wife went to school there. But on the day of that shooting, it led to a conversation on our little chat thread that ended up with the sister calling the brother a fascist, supporting a racist, homophobic jerk who died, and the brother calling the sister, well, at least we know who the sociopaths are in the family. You're dead to me. Pretty intense. And I've been working individually with each of those children over the last 6 weeks to try to process that and get to a different place. But it's indicative of the bigger challenge that we face. And the thing is that I know about both of them is they're both really good people. The other thing I know about both of them, they actually agree on not just 80, but about 90%. But they're each pulling into some narratives that drive things in a really difficult space. Now, as Keith was talking from the perspective of Congress, I'm going to talk about on the side of the people in the part of this process, right? So I want to talk about people from the perspective of on polarization, that it's not just a political condition. Really, it's a cultural reflex that's seeped into our families, our workplaces, and our communities. And it's a cultural reflex that we've got to change. It's a muscle we have to exercise differently. Now, a couple of things, and you've seen a lot of these studies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I'm just going to show you. If you look at this, these are issues, when you look at across the country, of Democrats, what the percentage of Democrats who actually would agree to or believe some of these behaviors are effective, and then the perception of the opposite party saying that. So just look at the first one, that How many would send threatening messages, right? So this is all about supporting partisan violence. You can see very low numbers. The dot is the mean. Everything else is showing all the different observations. But I mean, pretty low, below 25%. But then when you ask a Republican about Democrat or Democrat about Republican, it's 2x, right? And it goes across on all of these. Online, who would do online threats? Who would say violence for political goals? Who would say that it's okay to have violence after elections? There's a few more. So this is on support for undemocratic practices, that banning rallies, ignoring court rulings, freeze their social media, reduce voting stations. You can see that what's interesting is that most Democrats and Republicans are pretty darn similar on the actual numbers there. They're also pretty darn similar on the expectation of 2 to 3 times of what they think is actually out there. Now, you've seen some of these data, and when you look here, this is from the Pew Research Center, showing you that if you think about this extremism, again, this is showing the same evidence of the problem, right? Of we are thinking something that's not real. Now, that first one that I showed you was actually from IEEE, which you think, why are they doing that? Because they were studying how do you use visualization to help people get to reality. And so they did a lot of testing on that. And it was from August of 2025, this September this year, these data points. And then if you look at More in Common, their data, you can see the perception gap as well. So, but as you look at this, it's not just a misunderstanding that's the problem, because it's a moral judgment. We've moved from you're wrong and I'm right to you're evil and I'm good. And we've also moved to the notion that words are the same as violence. A lot of debate on that. Are they? When we make words equal violence, then violence can be, I tend to agree with our Governor Spencer Cox when he says words aren't violence, but words matter, and words that we engage in, especially when we think someone's evil, can normalize things that would justify violence as response. I asked, it's fun playing around with AI at times. I asked AI to visualize this for me, and here you go. We're responding to our shadows of what we think. This one particular daughter of mine on this, she was telling us the other day, she and her husband, they post on a few different social channels, probably 30 or 40 times a day, of some of the most extreme videos of stuff going on in Gaza and a few other things. And that conversation that I was talking about in our family chat thread, the reason she was so upset is she's like, why aren't you complaining about kids dying in Gaza every day and you're complaining about this guy? It was tone deaf to the moment, but she had a real concern, right? But she also told me, we got to move out of this country because Nazis are coming in at high levels and normal people are leaving even in faster levels. I said, no, talk with this daughter who's 30 years old. And I said, that's not true. What sources are you relying upon this? If you live in that extreme, the conflict entrepreneurs know the way to make money. Conflict entrepreneurs know how to get this prism. This is another version that AI did, is where we're seeing this. The conflict entrepreneurs know how to be able to get us to respond. And having worked in the advertising and business and consulting on branding and strategy, if we don't know this already, folks, we are the product on social media. It's not for us to connect with our family and friends and learn things. It's so that they can figure out exactly what you're doing, where you're doing it, what your emotive response is to various different words and images. And why do they care about that? Because if they can prove to the advertiser, to General Motors, or to whoever wants to spend money on advertising, that they know who you are, what you do, and what emotive state you are with different images and words, then guess what? The advertiser's like, sweet, because I need to reach people in this emotive state. And then guess what? Supply and demand, they can charge a whole lot more. So why do they spend all their money on trying to get algorithms to match that? Because we have an ad revenue-based media model, and that's the way they make their money. So when we go down that path, that dominant narrative is the thing that we have to be able to avoid. And that narrative is not reality. It's true that there are people, it's about 9% on each side, depending on which data source you look at, that do espouse some of the extreme ideology that's there, but the vast majority do not. And even those that do, in this country, we do have the ability to say things. And it was embedded and designed in the system. Now, the problem is not polarization in and of itself. The problem is toxic polarization of really that whole idea. So what I want to share with you briefly on this is, as an organization, Braver Angels, as Keith mentioned, I'd been volunteering in it for about 5 years. About 6 months ago, if you'd asked me what I'd be doing today, I would have never guessed this. But I was passionately involved as a volunteer, but it's an interesting shift when the thing that you do in your spare time becomes the thing you do all the time. But the door opened and I walked through it when some people said, you ought to apply for that job. I'm like, what job? Oh, well, David Blankenhorn's stepping down. They're going to hire a CEO. I said, okay, I think I'll do that. And here I feel honored to know that I am in that. Now, Brave Angels started back after the 2016 election. Had a group of Trump voters, Clinton voters, came and sat down. Back then, they did it over 3 to 4 days, actually. We don't do them quite that long as we did at the very beginning. But it's grown now to where if you go to our website, you can see we have 125 alliances across the country. We also have about 70, 80,000 on subscribers. We have 15,000 dues-paying members, and we have about 3,000 active volunteers. And when I say active volunteers, what I mean, I come from, yes, I live in Utah. I am a member of the dominant faith there, and I never thought of my religion as a volunteer basis, but it is. You're asked to serve, to work with young people or do whatever it is. These 2,000, 3,000 across our country, I'm talking people that are spending between 10 and 80 hours a week full-time just doing this. So why and what? What are the kinds of things that we do? We have workshops that we do. We're trying to get people in together to be able to practice the things that we're talking about here. We call it and talk about it through this lens of courageous citizenship. But the things that we do are putting people in places where you can practice the very things that Keith was talking about, that we leverage getting that common ground and taking it to Congress. We're doing it in actual local communities across the country. One of the most exciting things, if you've never tried it, is you can go to our website at braveangels.org and you can request to do a one-on-one conversation. You can choose to do it with someone that's a different generation, someone that's a different ideology, different race and ethnicity, rural versus urban, and then our volunteers will connect you with somebody that you don't know, some random person that also wants to do that. And then we have a guide that you do that. But all of these activities center around this notion and idea of courageous citizenship. Because what we're doing is we're helping people practice democracy the way it was designed. Debate and difference is central to this experiment. And I couldn't agree more with Keith's notion, or Keith's reminding us of the fact that that's the way it was designed in terms of having that debate and dialogue. Now, if you've followed or known anything about Braver Angels in the very recent past, we've just landed on what we call a new North Star. It's this idea of courageous citizenship. And it's this idea of really being able to act on it and have dialogue and connect. But we talk about it in 3 levels. And the 3 levels are right there, and now they're gone. Now we got it memorized. On a personal level, this is what we're trying to encourage you and all of your friends and neighbors. And I would also ask you, join Braver Angels. Join Common Sense American. By the way, I'm going to formally announce, even though we haven't figured out all the details, we are working with Common Sense American and Braver Angels. Just like we announced last week how we're working with Dignity Index. A lot of our members are also part of Common Sense. We're going to get more. We're going to get that up to 300,000 that you're doing that on that, not just 80. Now, acting and not reacting is saying that you individually have the ability, you have the personal agency to choose. A lot of people feeling so hopeless, so what do I do and not do? Well, you do have the choice to be able to act and not react. I want you to own that. At the community level, act together, experience it. When you do, light bulbs go off. And we've launched things like our citizen-led solution and actions at the hyper-local level that are exciting because people recognize that they can deal with interesting things together. Like a community recently that on the July 4th weekend wanted to have, some people wanted the sidewalk painted with pride flags. And other people are like, no, I want the American flag. Well, that's a perfect crisis where the media conflict entrepreneurs would be thrilled about, right? Well, what did these folks do? They engaged. They had a town hall workshop. They worked together. Braver Angels Alliance got involved. And they did some of the sidewalk with the flags of the United States of America and some with the pride. And they all got together and they felt good about it. That's America. And that's that third pillar of saying that we need to move forward to be able to act for the American society. And so we believe at Braver Angels that we envision an America where courageous citizenship is the honored norm. This is our vision, that where we renew civic culture and build trust across political differences. And when we practice this kind of citizenship, we begin to push back. We quietly but powerfully, we push back against the dominant narrative that says division is inevitable and contempt is normal. Right now, contempt is normal. Right now, dialogue and being involved in these things is actually the counterculture, pushing against with that dominant narrative, and we need to. And we believe our theory of change is that if you can do this at these 3 levels of personal and community, that will lead to the national. Because it involves each of us deciding that we own it instead of acting like not only not talking about the elephant in the room, but letting the elephant become the room. It's our choice to be the people, not just live the principle that we are the people. We also start voting not just for shouts and the loudest, but for who's willing to solve problems. But doing this without sacrificing or surrendering our own ideology, beliefs, and convictions, we stay rooted in our ideological homes, and that's the heart of the American experiment. Nothing about Braver Angels is ever going to ask you to change your beliefs, your ideas. But what we are going to do is we're going to work to do this. Is we're going to ask you to practice courageous citizenship, because it's what we do, and we believe these are the three outcomes. That we're going to be able to restore hope and confidence, build human connection across political division, and be able to repair the social fabric of our nation. Because when we do that, collaborative action becomes possible. And connection is at the heart of the issue here that's preventing us to being able to move forward. Our republic depends on this. Our founders gave us this system to be able to move forward on this. But it can be rebuilt. We believe not from the top down, but from the inside out with each one of us. So let's get to some dialogue and discussion. Looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
Well, we have two ways to ask questions. You can do it through the Slido, and also in tradition with Pizza and Perspectives, we have a microphone here. If anyone wants to stand up and line up at the microphone to ask a question in person, we love that.
I naively thought the number of times in the last 10 years or so that I've said to myself, there's been some threat on the horizon, and I've said, that can't happen in this country, and then we've done it. It's more than I can count. It's making me really humble and sober. And chief among them was January 6th. It's just stunning to me. I mean, I was viscerally ill as I watched that. I thought for about 72 hours that it was going to be the reckoning and the catalyst, and that we were going to break the fever dream. And it looked like that. You had the kinds of diverse leadership stepping up against it that I thought that was the case. And within about 72 hours, it had all snapped back. And so it was deeply disappointing, and it ended up being, rather than a point of rallying Congress and unification, which it was for a few hours, for a few days, became a point of even more bitter divide. Some of the most bipartisan members of Congress I know, that was pretty close to, talked about how they turned down a different hall when they saw somebody from the other side a couple of days after that. So it ended up being, polarizing rather than uniting. If you don't mind, can I just do a little relapse on academic on that point? A bit of a nuance on that, needing to do the work internally for us to be able to turn the corner. I occupy kind of a funny position now. My claim to fame when I was an academic was bringing the role of emotions and social relationships to negotiation, conflict resolution. Rational choice theories had a stranglehold on it. And I was the guy that proved with really impressive evidence that people are angry, that people are nastier when they're angry than when they're not angry. That was a really shocking thing to say in the late 1990s. But I was making the point to do the practical problem solving of resolving negotiations and conflicts. The level of emotion between the parties really matters. Like, that's what I'm known for as an academic. In a very real way, I've flipped the script myself on that. And if you look at the way Common Sense American is organized, you could go directly at the relationship first, or you can tee up the kind of practical problem solving in the right way, and that can be the lever by which you demonstrate to them, hey, we have more in common, and the temperature starts to come down. So there's a deep irony, given my intellectual tradition, that I kind of start there, but especially given the low issues polarization. I'm not sure that starting on the social or affective polarization is the smartest way to go. Start on the issues, and then that demonstrates in a powerful way, oh, we agree on more than we knew, and the temperature comes down.
Yeah, Keith, that's very consistent with what we found, and I've been on this job for, I think, 11 weeks, maybe 12. We've been making a lot of ground. We've been running fast with, we go for our next chapter because we hit 10 years next year. And the trend we've seen of a trend, I'm more of what people are asking for, is the ability to be more engaged in action on real issues. Could be national, could be, but really where we're trying to go heavy on is at the hyper-local level, like that one simple example I was telling you about the sidewalks. Because of what you just said, when you do that, the light bulb goes off, and you realize, and you see your neighbor or someone that's in your community, and you realize, wow, those labels aren't actually true to the person. I think it's the same dynamic with road rage, right? Like, people do insane things when they pretend like not another person in the other car. Well, there is, and we have the same permission we've given. So I think being able to do things is what matters. And so with our local alliances, we're kind of setting them up right now to be able to be these local places where people can come together to try to practice this actual these democratic principles within our constitutional republic with people. But here's the key, and this is what we do. Like every time we start a new alliance, you have to have someone with a red ideology and a blue ideology. A lot of people think that we mean Republicans and Democrats. No, because a plurality of Americans are rejecting both parties right now. But we all have an ideological home that you can lean toward. Do you lean more conservative and red? Do you lean more progressive, liberal, blue? So when we start a new alliance, you got to have both there, because if you don't have the conflict, then you're not practicing the thing that we're trying to demonstrate and realizing that it's helpful. And that's the same when it comes to acting on issues locally, is you don't do it with just all your friends that agree with you and go do a protest. And I'm not saying those are bad. That happens. Everyone agrees with you, go do a protest. We're suggesting something different. We're saying find the people that disagree with you. We did this with legislators on DEI. 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats in the State House and Senate in Utah before the legislative session. We didn't just recruit anybody. We spent 6 months recruiting the people that were proposing the legislation and those that were aggressively opposed to it. And then we had for 2 days by 8 to 9 hours together. So it's that back and forth. But I want to circle back now to January 6th, because I agree. I thought that night was actually pretty important that they came back and did the vote. I thought it was just hugely important that happened. I also thought, oh, well, this is going to get us to move forward and recognize the problem. But here's why I don't think it did. There were many, I'm going to put a number around it, but let's just say a large number of people, and certainly that were there in Washington, D.C. that day, and the rest of the country, that there was something very real that they were feeling, and they were acting on it. Now, they happened to act on it in a way that I totally disagree with myself personally. I'm a conservative. I've been a Republican for most of my life. I'll tell you, I don't know what that means right now, if I'm talking honestly with my own view. But the division, the unity that came immediately after was that, okay, something's wrong with our system. But the reason it immediately went back into division is because it exposed that, and no solution in mind from a systemic incentive to address it yet. Why? Because of money, because of the way the parties control the process, and because of the ad revenue of social media, among others, that throwing the gasoline on the fire. So I think that's why our philosophy is that if we can work with individual people and communities to bring about change, they will begin to elect different people and reward different behavior within Congress, so that Congress actually, because my personal belief is whatever you think is about Trump, the problem is less about the White House and more about Congress actually playing their role, but systemic got to change that. And so that's the philosophy that we're trying to go about, because gerrymandering only works because we buy into it. That's the biggest irony to me. It's like we act like that's some definitive thing. Well, that's only because you choose to vote how they tell you to vote. How about if you voted for the person rather than the party and use the party for your ideology?
We'll take another question, and then I'll add another one from the audience, and then we'll let you guys respond and see how that goes.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question to you two. Listen, I'm so amazed I came today. I almost didn't come. No, this has been more than worth yeah, anyway. Thank you very much. And really, I admire so much your not mathematical, but your objective measurements of the difference. No, that's profound. And grassroots, I've been to grassroots organizations my whole life, and that is a way that really works telling the issues. You mentioned the word systemic problem. I'm going to make a case, and I probably shouldn't make it, that our Constitution is systemically flawed. And until we correct that, I notice any interest in global issues, but a lot of the global issues that we're now confronted with now are causing a lot of the polarization, particularly the evolution of technology and weaponization. Everything's weaponized now. And so that makes everything on edge. Anyway, so in 250, it's just a coincidence, 250 days from now, we're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And what you all are doing in terms of bringing communities together to talk about self-evident truths. Neil deGrasse Tyson, 3 types of truths: personal, political, and objective. You know, we all know the objective truths. A child should not die before their parent. 1 + 1 = 2. That's where I think we need to focus. What's the plan for the 250th celebration? Do you have something leading up to that that could bring people together to make something happen on that daytime to improve the health of communities? Health. It's got to be that. Anyway.
Thank you. Great. Well, and we'll address that in a second. Thank you. All right, next question.
Hi, my name's Mike, and I am a member of Braver Angels, and I want to get involved in Common Sense American. So I appreciate everything you're bringing today. I want to ask you about a word and a concept that's weighing heavily with me, which is hypocrisy, which seems to be endemic among national politics and in social media as well. And I don't know if you were to study this academically and chart the degree of hypocrisy in the country, but it just seems stunning to me that people on both sides take one position when it's about them, take a different position when it's about somebody else. And so my question is it possible to correct that in this polarized environment? Because I think, as you said, the whole, what both organizations are doing is to, and if you say to someone, hey, you're being hypocritical, that may not land well. So my question is, how is it feasible to point that out without causing even more harm?
First, a recommendation of a little book called To Save Humanity by a fellow clinical psychologist named Dana Ackley, which is about how to calm our amygdala from getting into hate and focus on our prefrontal lobe to be more reasonable. But my question is about, I'm from the Mount Vernon area. I went to the local farmers market, one tent for Republicans, MAGA people, and one friend for liberal Democrats. I went up to the MAGA tent and I said, I'm not interested in debating with you about politics. I'd like to know more, learn from you what you can tell me about what leads you to support Trump and the MAGA movement. That lasted about 20 minutes. Then I had to shop. As I was walking away, a man from that tent came after me. He said, I was so impressed. You were genuinely interested in learning from us. He and I then talked. We have a lot in common. So we went to breakfast together. We didn't talk politics. We got to know each other even better. We're going to play tennis soon. Great guy. And my interest is how to bring people together, MAGA supporters, liberal Democrats, to get to know what they personally have in common. And I have some ideas on how to do that. I think that'll make a big difference. And I'm wondering what especially Braver Angels might be doing to bring people together to learn to trust and relate better to people who differ.
Perfect, thank
Well,
you.
I'll just quickly on that you're singing from a sheet of music. If the core of everything we do is to facilitate precisely what you're just describing, and we do it through a few different techniques. There's a really cool thing of the fishbowl that we do in some of our workshops. But there's also, one of the things I like to point out is there's one simple question that if everyone in this room would apply this to every conversation you have with someone that's different with you, when you start feeling this, that like you can feel the blood pressure, like, oh, if you stop, instead of going right into your attack of why that person's wrong or your point of view or even answering it, stop and ask this question. Tell me more about your life experience that shapes the way you view this issue. That's a question of curiosity that if you genuinely mean it, it will change the framing of every relationship that you have with someone that's different than you. Don't throw in Trump or no Trump or issue or whatnot. See them as a human and ask that, because curiosity requires that. And so all the skills that we are training in Braver Angels are precisely that. But what we're pivoting to and doing more of is what Keith was saying is we're finding that people can discover and want to learn those skills when they're in pursuit of collaborative action, solving an issue or building something together.
We often say that the first principle and the best practice of civil discourse is listening for understanding, and just the way Maury was describing it, listening for the merit in what they're saying, not just the flaw. We also do a similar sort of thing in our state legislative program. We've conducted workshops in about 32 states now with about 4,000 or 5,000 state legislators. And the beginning of the workshop is we just ask them to share with the group a formative experience or person who shaped who they are. That's it. And it is that discovering the human being on the other side. And it's just amazing that kind of trust that builds if you're listening and you're listening about something significant. So that there certainly is that, to do that just directly, as both of our organizations do. And I really do think the kind of deeper connection that you're seeing between the National Institute for Civil Discourse and Braver Angels is this conviction that Maury has expressed well of if we can recognize how much we share in common, not just in a nice conversation or in the abstract, but as we're actually accomplishing something together. If you go to our homepage at commonsenseamerican.org, you'll see a video of our members talking about their experience, and you can just feel the power of them saying, "We're for." It is just so exciting to realize that they've come together across this bitter divide and actually, like, passed acts of Congress. Really brings people together. So, Mary, we need your help to help us remember the other questions. Yeah, it's one of the first conversations you and I had, I think, when you first became CEO. Is like we were standing on Capitol Hill together. I remember Maury saying, "Hey, we got the 250th." So I don't know.
I mean, I can tell what we're doing. It's and also the skills that we were just talking about right afterward with Natalie LaRoche, who, if you haven't met her, you're just going to be blown out of your mind. We're going to practice those skills in a formal setting in a debate where you can actually, it'll be like a debate you've never seen, and practicing it will be really powerful. But 250 is a huge opportunity next year. 250th anniversary, World Cup, but also there's maybe an election next year that might be a little bit one of the strangest elections, intense, right? All of the things together. So yeah, we're working with, in a couple of weeks, we're going to be able to announce something really exciting about our convention. The only thing I can officially say right now is June 28th, that weekend. But there's some really other exciting news, so be on the lookout in the next week or two when we tell about that. Every year we have this big convention, we get 1,000, 1,500, I think we're gonna do 1,500 this year, equal numbers of cross ideology. And it'll be all America 250 focused. But the other thing I want to point out is that there's a lot of us in the industry that are coming together around this concept of be the people. And there's gonna be a lot of advertising and marketing on this and a ground game. And I know Braver Angels, we're gonna be heavily involved on the ground game side, because be the people fits perfectly with the idea of courageous citizenship. It's the idea of practicing this and saying, first off, let's recognize that we are the people, but let's be the people and let's inspire one-on-one to do that. So we're looking at a lot of things around that. Our convention plus, we're even kicking around the idea of a road tour and people with their RVs and some cool stuff in the fall. Because we believe people are gonna need something counter-programming to the election. While they're feeling good about America, and then they're being inundated with this person's an idiot, it's going to kill you and get rid of you. In certain states, you'll be hearing that every day for 6 months.
I'll just say, and we may do a little of this together, but it will not only be the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, it'll be the 200th anniversary of Jefferson and Adams dying on that anniversary within a couple of hours, the two authors of our independence. And that is a fantastic story for today of two friends that gave us independence, became bitter political enemies, and then were reconciled and then went to their graves at virtually the same moment. There's some elements of that story that are not well known.
And the country had a response, you were teaching me, that is exactly what we need now. The
country was so taken aback that on the 50th anniversary, the first Jubilee, where the whole country was a little surprised that we'd made it that far, that we'd made it to 50 years. And then they realized that, and Adams had died at the same time, it sparked these memorials across the country to kind of try to come to terms with crazy experience. And inevitably, I've studied most of the talks that were given in the memorials that are available. And inevitably, the speakers at those memorials drew the lesson from that. The Adams-Jefferson relationship was an allegory for the nation, that we couldn't let political differences lead to animosity. And Jefferson and Adams went to their graves still having some profound disagreements, but did so as dear, dear friends. They had renewed that friendship. And so I think for the 250th anniversary, the 200th anniversary of Adams and Jefferson is a point that deserves emphasis.
I was wondering, do you think that our current two-party system is what's encouraging further and further polarization? And do you believe that we have any future with third parties in our current political system?
Great, let's take another one.
Just had a question regarding polarization and its role in the increasing amount of time these government shutdowns are lasting, and how the parties are refusing to compromise.
This question is from Maury Giles. Am I saying your name right?
You are.
Oh, sweet. Okay. So you mentioned social media and social media data for-profit advertising. And I was hoping to ask you a question that uses your imagination. So, especially with your children as a sample of polarized people, do you have any ideas about how social media data could be leveraged for common ground instead of advertising and for profit? And how could we build like platform for that kind of movement?
I'm going to make it confusing and take even one more, our last question, and then we'll wrap it up, and I'll help you keep track.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Alejandro. I am a proud member of Braver Angels and will be joining your organization as well because of the fabulous work you're both doing. My question has to do with getting the common American involved, right? I think that today we're seeing the people that really care about politics are the ones that are involved. They're the ones doing things on both sides and are the ones that are going out to the polls. How do we get the people, and let's say college students, because that's the area that I work in, that could care less about all the things that are going on and are just so sick and tired of the division that they just throw their arms up and say, screw this, they go hang out in their dorm rooms and they're done. So I'd love to hear from both of you a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay, let's have each of you just pick one of those questions, and let's start with the third party.
Man, there's nobody in the country probably would more like to think that a third party is viable in this country, from the center. And the number of obstacles between here and there of a viable third party are more than you can count and higher than you can count. It is very, very hard to do. I could relapse and do a whole semester just on that topic. Let me just say this. I do think that there are versions, I think that we could get 70 to 80% of what one would hope to get out of a third party with something a little less than a third party. And it would start with working coalition, bipartisan working coalition in the Senate and the House. And given these very narrow partisan divides and things like a government shutdown and stuff where you have these, and the earlier question about these reckonings, we have these moments. You wouldn't, within Congress, different for the presidency, but within Congress, you don't need a third party to have a majority. With these narrow partisan majorities, just 10 or 20%, and they're going to run things, right? Because they can work with both sides on that. You have a little bit the beginnings of that with this Senate Common Sense Coalition that has in fact been the center of American policymaking over the last 10 years. And there's a group in the House called Problem Solvers. We've recently stood up a new House group with the Senate group, the Common Sense Coalition there. And this is a big group to be an ulterior motive too. But we're working very closely with them and what issues to work on next and working even more closely with them than we have in the past. And our ostensible aim in doing that is to work on issues together and pass legislation. To me, the even more important part is to thicken that relationship across the divides so that they do that more readily and more frequently. And when we get to these government shutdown or these kinds of points of reckoning, I'll share this one little anecdote. We stood up this new House Common Sense Coalition to work with the Senate Common Sense Coalition. And they had the four co-chairs, so Senators Murkowski and Bennett on the Senate side, Congressman Swazi and Bacon on the House side. And at our behest, they met for the first time 2 weeks ago. It was the first time that the House co-chairs and the Senate co-chairs had ever met each other. It is amazing how thin those relationships are, especially if it's across the chambers. And so just the fact that, and I got a call from the senior staff after the meeting, just get in, and she said, that is the best meeting in Congress I have seen in my career. They just had an immediate chemistry. So I do think that there are ways of getting those members of Congress to work more closely. And if they were functioning along those lines, you'd get about 70 or 80% of what you needed for a third party. Tougher nut to crack with the president.
We're trying to do that at the states. We've got 6 states that we're working on legislative caucuses that they're standing up. They don't have to call them Brave Angels, but we're asking them to do it around that. But the only thing I'll add to that is that we've got to, in addition to helping them in terms of setting up the federal level or at state level, our elected officials, they need support. They need because for them to take a stand on any issue right now that's in the mix is because of the threat of a primary that will come from their own party. And so they need to know that there's a base of voters, irrespective of party, whether you voted for them or not, that actually will support. And so as Braver Angels, we're trying to help our local alliances to be able to connect and move forward. And I think that's to the question around getting the everyday people in college in. That's, one of our fastest programs is in our College Debate and Discourse Alliance in colleges. And you've got Doug Spry here, and then Natalie and others are doing these. The numbers of people that are cruising in college campuses that are participating in these debates, in our Common Ground workshop, their ABC dialogue on campus, there's a number of things that we're doing. We're helping them see and practice these different skills. And I think we have to do it in a way that really makes a difference of helping the everyday person. That's why the local matters so much, because if you can do something in your neighborhood or community, it starts to get hope and confidence as something goes beyond. And then the last thing I'll respond to is on this whole, like, how do you bottle up social media? Do you remember Monsters, Inc.? I've got 5 grandkids, so I've seen it a few times recently. You remember, why did they bottle up the screams, right? They go back to Monster World, Equity Energy. What did Sully open their idea to at the end of the movie? A lot of people don't remember what happened at the end. What did they discover about laughter? Significantly more powerful. They bottled it up, and it could actually, so all of a sudden the monsters, I still think it's a little creepy that going into kids' bedrooms, but at least they're going in to get them to laugh, right? And we intrinsically know within each of us as humans that laughter and love and those elements of dignity rather than contempt mean more, they carry on more, but they take more effort. I personally believe that's by design in terms of the purpose of life, to see what we want to choose. But if we can figure out, I think we have to figure out how do you do the Monsters, Inc. shift with social media? Because I believe there's evidence to show that you bottle those things up in a way that's not the scary stuff, that it actually is infinitely more powerful, but it takes more work, takes more strategy, and it's not as quick, but it lasts longer.
Okay, we're going to end by doing something for these 2 organizations. After the Charlie Kirk shooting, these organizations and many other organizations quickly came together and started something called the Better Than This movement. And we asked for videos from people telling that, we're better than this violence that we're seeing. And we like to do a very quick video with you guys in the background saying we're better than this. So if everybody could kind of stand up and move towards the middle, and Keith is going to take an expert selfie with this.
Just so you know, on the social media front, we've done a number of these, and the large groups like this with the selfie, Maury, stay in it with me, are the most effective ones on social media. Oh, that's a good-looking group there.
Better than this. And as you're going back to your seats, if I can make one plea to each of you. If you're not already involved in Common Sense American, get involved. If you're not already a member of Braver Angels, or if you just want to sign up. If you want to be a dues-paying member of $12 a year, great. Same as AARP in terms of cost. But if you just want to sign up for our newsletter, sign up. We need more people.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to Maury and Keith and to Mary. But really quickly, I want to thank everyone for joining us and thank everyone who contributed to this. First of all, Mary and Maddie, Yenting, Chase, Amber from Carter School Events, Julie and Melissa from University Life, Matt from Facilities, Melissa Galvez, who helped with the low-tech engagement, and I hope you all will contribute to that, the poster over there as you're leaving. There's one over there. And to Professor Rothbart for his support and enthusiasm in giving us the platform to hold this. So thanks so much for that, and you can check out more opportunities to engage with Delta